les yeux.
We thought we would begin by drinking a toast. Well, welcome everybody to City Lights, and to those of you online as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. Tonight's event is being co-sponsored by our friends at Villa Albertine and the Consul General of France in San Francisco. And we are delighted to have Doan Bui with us here tonight. We had a lovely event last night at Night of Ideas, and speaking about Oulipo. But tonight we're going to expand the reach of our talk. Doan is a writer and journalist currently in artist residency at Villa Albertine here in San Francisco. And while in the Bay Area, she's investigating the history and geography of Angel Island and narratives of exile. She has received numerous awards for her work. This includes the Prix Albert Londres for her work about refugees. Her memoir, Le silence de mon père, published in 2016, won the Prix de la Porte Dorée and also the Prix Amerigo Vespucci. Her fiction novel, La Tour, from Editions Grasset, was shortlisted for the Goncourt Premier Roman and the Orange Prize. Her most recent book is Le Monde de Nulle. Ms. Bui is also a scenarist for graphic novels and has worked with such notables as Leslie Plée, Isabelle Monnin, also with the Ukraine writers Pavlo and Viktoria Matyusha. Really, she's had some wonderful, wonderful collaborations. I should add, she also has a very deep interest in the Oulipo, as I mentioned. We're really such an honor to have you with us here tonight. And also, joining us, we're delighted and very honored to have Alan Yeh, who is a PhD candidate in French at UC Berkeley. He specializes in refugee aesthetics, memory, and food in the 20th and 21st century French and Francophone literature, particularly of the Vietnamese diaspora. He also teaches undergraduate language and literary courses. Most recently, he's taught advanced literature courses in Francophone diasporas of Southeast Asia. So we're going to be having some space for a Q&A towards the end of our talk. And we, once again, hope that you will wait till we come to you with the microphone so our friends online can hear you. Or for those of you online, we have posted links. If you want to learn more about Doan's work, there'll be a link there for you to find out more. So Doan Bui and Alan Yeh, welcome to City Lights, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be there. And I'm so delighted that we can pursue our conversation that was started yesterday. It's so great.
Yeah. So, diasporic, refugee, and migratory histories and narratives are central to your work. I'd like to begin by talking about how you arrived at this moment. Would you describe the arc of your personal journey and what brought you here?
I will just start to make a little bricolage. So let me put down the microphone. So I don't know if you can see it on the camera. For the,
Do you want me to hold it? Or?
So, do you know what it is? Yeah. So, can someone tell me what it is? Yeah, it's a Mobius strip. So I wanted to make a Mobius strip for Peter. So it's my gift for Peter. Very nice gift, very expensive gift.
Thank you.
So this Mobius strip, I think it's a little bit. I put it in all of my books. It's one of my Oulipian constraints. There is always a Mobius strip in my book because I think it's the symbol for me of time. So actually, I was talking with Sabine when I arrived at the Villa Albertine. There was a book of Alain Damasio. I think you met Alain Damasio when he was there. And he was saying that time for European was very vertical, in silos. And for American, it was very horizontal. And actually, I didn't I didn't feel I didn't agree with him. So either maybe I'm not European and maybe I'm not American. That's why, because to me the time is really circular. It's really like this Mobius strip. So you see when you go on the Mobius strip, you go like this. You go forward and then you go backward, and it's like each time it's like present always bumps into the past, and past bumps into the future. And it's strange because each time I start a new book or I write a text, or each time I go for my job as a journalist, I go on the field, for example, if last time when I was in Ukraine or when I went to the West Bank, each time I see like resonances with the past. Obviously, there are also resonances with not my past, but the past of my parents. Because my parents. Actually, I'm in France because there was a war in the countries of my parents, Vietnam War and Indochina War, and being a byproduct of war, you know that your life it's a product of what if there had been no war. It's like I'm a product of Ukrainia. Ukraine, c'est ça? Uchronie, Alan? How would you say that? It's science fiction, like when Philippe Cadic, he imagined that the Nazi had won the war. When you imagine that something, and when you are a refugee, so a son of refugee, a migrant, so you always think about what if I had stayed in Vietnam? What if my parents didn't go to France? For example, what if we had been to the US? I would have been growing up with my cousin Van, who is here, and my life would have been very different. So it's something also maybe that transforms you into a storyteller, because you're always compelled to imagine story. And I've been also working a lot about the topic of migration. And I'm always surprised when I interview migrants and refugees about the fact that they don't have a choice. They always have to make up stories. So I think I don't remember if it was with you, Peter, or with Carl yesterday that we were talking about Odysseus. But to me, all the migrants that the refugees that I have met during my trips for my newspapers, they always reminded me of Odysseus, because Odysseus, he's really, in Homer, he's this guy who always wants to put on some disguise, and he always changes names and identities, and he's a storyteller, and actually he doesn't have a choice, because if he doesn't tell story, he will die in the story of Homer. And it's the same with Scheherazade. When she tells stories with the Caliph, she has to tell story. And usually when you cross a border, you also have to tell a story. For example, even if you are not in danger, even if you are just for example, someone like me crossing the border, I was very scared this time. So I didn't say that I was with Villa Albertine, and I made up a story, which was always true. Also true. I was also visiting my family, but I didn't dare to say that I was, doing this investigation about Angel Island and about migration, and maybe it's because I'm the daughter of refugees, but I see that each time I have to cross borders, I'm so afraid, and I'm always thinking about the stories I would have to make up, like Ulysse, because I think that if I make up a good story, maybe it will save my ass. So it's something that is really part of my work. And those stories always get mixed up between present and past. And each time one of my books is published, it's weird because for example, when I published my memoir, Le silence de mon père, it's about silence. When it was sent to the print, I was in Lesbos, in an island in Greece, where a lot of people from Syria were escaping war. And it was very weird because people, at that time we were talking about, we were saying both peoples, and we were talking, making comparison with what happened with the Vietnamese and Asians and Cambodian both peoples. And when I was writing this memoir, I was obviously struggling with the silence of my father and the title of the book, because my father became aphasic like 20 years ago. But finally, I realized that I didn't know anything about the past of my family, because I had never talked with my parents about this past. So I knew very, very little. And during this investigation, I discovered that the cousin of my father had died trying to cross the sea. And it was very strange, because no one had ever told this story in my family. And at the same time, as a journalist, I had always been writing stories about migrant and refugee who drowned into the sea. And I was really obsessed by telling their story and finding their names. And each time, I would write stories about relics and about, trying to give them a voice, even if they had disappeared. But in my own family and my own story, I didn't know the story of this uncle. I didn't know his name. So for me, it was very important in this book to write his name down, and to also tell his story. So that was the first time, the present and past was bumping into each other. And when I was writing La Tour, so my novel, which is an homage to Pérec, it was published in 2022. And I was not very lucky, because 1 month afterwards, Ukraine, there was a full-scale invasion, and Russia invaded Ukraine. And again, I could see so many similarities between what happened in Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, the war in Ukraine. I would go to the border, and I would see so many women crying with their children and escaping war and refugees. And afterwards, I would, meet families who had lost their children. And each time, it's the same grief, and there is this wonderful book which was written by Baonin, and the title is The Sorrow of War. And obviously, the sorrow of war is the same in Vietnam. It's the same in Lebanon. It's the same. Everywhere. The sound of someone's crying is the same. And when you have because I have weird stuff on my telephone, like picture of dead children, and that people sent me because they needed they needed for me to testify and to write about it. And it's the same grief, if you talk with a Palestinian woman or a Ukrainian woman. And obviously, our parents, Vietnamese parents, they have seen stuff, a lot of stuff, but they didn't talk about that. So it's very difficult when you are in the situation right now, because I was born in France, so in a country which is peaceful, so I'm in the position I have the agency to write and to tell those stories. And I feel that I need to tell those stories. I feel that I need to, as Aimé Césaire wrote in Le Discours contre le colonialisme, he made all those parallels with all those countries who have been exploited and dominated. And he said that we need to be the mouth of the griefs that don't have mouth, or something like this. Sorry for the translation. And I think that our generation, we are this generation who has the possibility to be those mouths, even if we are in the margins. But nevertheless, we can try to be those voices and those mouths. But on the other hand, we know that for our parents, because they were scared to talk because Vietnam was communist, so it was very dangerous to talk. For example, about this uncle who died in the sea, when you fled as a boat people, one of my aunts, she also fled as a boat people, but you had to hide the fact that you were escaping. So you couldn't ask for news, if you stayed. For example, my grandmother, she stayed in Vietnam, and she let my aunt escape, but she could just wait. In the case of Uncle Go, the parents, they could only wait, and then when there was silence for 1 month, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, then they knew. Or they knew, but without really knowing, because when someone disappears and when you can't even bury this person, it's the most terrible way of dying, I think, because you can't honor the death, you can't honor the memory of the deceased people. And if we are human, is that we need to honor those memories. And in the case of all them, we don't even know the number. It's each time, I'm looking for the number of the how many people died during those years, 78, 79, 80, when the boat people arrived. And it changes from 250,000 to 1 million. Because actually no one even, made the math. And there are so many tragedies like this where we don't even have the figures. So it also raises the question about who deserves to be a statistic, who deserves which people, whose lives. For example, I also discovered that during the Indochina War, so France has colonized Vietnam for 100 years. And in France, you don't know so much about the colonization, and you don't know so much about the war in Indochina. And I'm Vietnamese, but for a long time, I thought that the Algeria war was much more violent, and there were much more people that died during the Algerian war, because even if it's still a taboo topic in France, the Algeria war, during the decolonization war, there were a lot of intellectuals in France that fought for Algeria, like Jean-Paul Sartre, like Marguerite Duras, a lot of them. So there is a generation of intellectuals in Paris who were very involved in this decolonization movement in Algeria. But in the case of Indochina, maybe because it was so far, Indochina is just Dien Bien Phu. It's just this battle of Dien Bien Phu. And I realized that finally, you in the US, you know that there was My Lai, this horrible massacre. But I discovered that there was many My Lai that were committed by the French army. But we don't even know, the names of those villages. And we don't, and actually, because Vietnam is a poor country, it doesn't have the capacity to honor those deaths. So, for example, when you go to Saigon, you go to the Museum of the Atrocities of the War. There is a big part about America, because also there was a lot of American donations, and all those journalists, very famous photojournalists, they were American, so they gave also those pictures, and that's how this museum can also be able to tell this story. And it's strange because the whole part of the Indochina War, you don't see anything about that. So it is quite weird. So I'm in the place where story, I'm in the place of void in the term of history, because it's not a history that has been written in our school books. And I'm also in the place of void in terms of narratives, because our parents didn't tell us this story. And also when I grew up reading books, I couldn't find this story. I couldn't find people, with stories like ours. So I think when you grow up like this, you tend to think that your story do not deserve to be told, because maybe they're not important enough, or you think you don't deserve to be, in the narrative, and your narrative is not good enough, or something like this. And it takes a lot of time to deconstruct this mindset and to understand that, there is this void, there is a blank page, a blank notebook, but maybe you can add something. And I'm very grateful that in the United States, the Vietnamese American community, the Vietnamese American diaspora, has written those narratives, because for me, the first time I read this story in English, it was something, very, it was life-changing, because for the first time you see a story that where you feel represented. So I think that finally all my work is about this question about telling those stories that were not told. And my project with Villa Albertine, Angel Island, it's interesting also because I didn't know about Angel Island. I think I discovered the existence of Angel Island, maybe it was 6 years ago. I was I was watching a documentary about the 6 Chinese survivors from the Titanic. And I was very stunned by this story because I didn't know that there was, Chinese immigrants in the Titanic, and I didn't know that 6 survived. But those who survived, they were not allowed to, even if they know it was horrible and they had survived this catastrophe, but they were not allowed to disembark in New York because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and they were deported. And because in this film they were telling this story, they told also about Angel Island and about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And for me, it was the first time I heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act and this place, Angel Island. And I heard about the poems that were carved into the walls. And I thought it was so beautiful that, such things exist, and that they had written their soul, and that their soul was still, their ghost and their soul was still on those walls. And I think yesterday, again about this Mobius, Mobius strip, the first day I arrived in the Villa Albertine, near the Whole Foods, when we went to go shopping, because Sylvia lives with me in this house, there was a big wall and there was a graffiti. And the graffiti, it was written, "Listen to the wall." And the day afterwards, I went to Angel Island, and I was so moved to see those walls. And I was so moved to see those poems. And some poems, they are erased, and some others, they reappeared because the painting is going a little bit away. And so it means that the walls can speak. And and also the ghosts are everywhere. They are in the walls, but they are also in all the objects, and they are also in our phones. When we have the names of the people who passed away, of photos and stuff like this. So we have all those ghosts around us, and I think being a writer is about listening to the ghosts and helping to give them a voice, like being like doing some kind of shamanic trick or something like this.
Alan, I can hear your cognitive process at work. I'm going to turn it over to you now because I can see your notes too.
No, thank you. This is so fascinating, and you really see this this thread of thinking throughout your work, not only with the Mobius strip, but these constant references to Odysseus, to Scheherazade, to Penelope, who's weaving and reweaving the tapestry, waiting for Odysseus to come home. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, actually, too, because the idea of Odysseus is the nostos, the journey home, the return home. But for much of the narratives that you write about, for much of the people that you write about in your news reporting, many of them cannot return home. and that really is the marked characteristic of exile. And so I just found that to be so evocative of an image, and yet so different from the mythology, the folklore that we have about these journeys, right? And moreover, the idea of testimony and proof of existence is so evocative for me as well, as the way that refugees and migrants exist in legal and juridical language is through testimony. To be considered a refugee, to have the legal designation as such, means that you have to be able to attest and give a testimony of persecution, right? And that's especially pressing today. So thank you so much for bringing that up. And I'm wondering maybe if I could pose a question, as you've been talking about your professional journey, your personal journey. It's been, so Le Silence de mon Père came out in 2016, and you've returned to the themes in Le Silence de mon Père in your first novel, La Tour, and then also returning to the project that you evoke in Le Silence de mon Père that you had started, but then put aside, put away, that it has eventually come out most recently, was it this past August or September? Right, Le Pays de Nulle Part. So I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about that process of delving into this very personal journey, reflecting on your familial silence, on your own silences, and having to learn more about your family's history and then uncover that for yourself.
Yes, I think that's why I relate to Pérec, because all the work of Pérec is constructed around one void, the loss of his parents, and also the silence around the loss of his parents that were killed during the Shoah, because no one told him when he was a kid what was happening. So I think I really relate to how can you construct yourself with such silence. And I'm always pursuing, and I'm always trying to, put some words in the silence. And, sometimes I say that memory, it's like a Kleenex that you have forgotten into the pockets of your jean. And, you put it on the washing machine. And then you're like, oh, damn it, I forgot the Kleenex in the washing machine. And afterwards, after the washing machine, the Kleenex, it's all in very, very small bits. And you can't, it's a mess. And you have all this snow of white everywhere on your black T-shirt, And I think for us, people like, children of refugee, our memory is like this, it's full of holes. It's like this Kleenex, which was like totally messed up by the washing machine. And obviously there is the washing machine process. I think I should write a book and the title would be The Washing Machine. Because when you are an immigrant, you have to be into this washing machine, because you have to reinvent yourself and you have to believe that there is a blank slate. And for example, my mom, she hates all the houses. She always wanted to be in a brand new house, and she always wanted to imagine her life like a blank slate. So, and obviously she's also obsessed with the washing machine. Each time, we put a T-shirt and she puts it on the washing machine, she's really obsessed by the washing machine. So I think there is this, this urge to have this blank slate and to forget about the past, because it's too painful. It's too painful because anyway, their country has been totally erased, and even their language has been erased. So it's so hard to remember. It's so painful that maybe they think that it's better to forget and not to talk about that. So of course, if they don't talk about that, they don't transmit it. But still, the memory is still there lingering, like this Kleenex, you know, this Kleenex that they forgot on the pockets. And then we have to deal with, and to come back to a Perekian image, this Kleenex, it would be like the jigsaw puzzle, you know, from Gaspard Winkler in Life as a User Manual, because there is this wonderful character in Life in a User Manual, which is Bartle Booth, and he has to paint 500 paintings, and he goes all around the world, and then he sends the painting to another guy, and he wants the guy to make a puzzle, and then he will destroy all those paintings, and he tries to make this puzzle, and finally he cannot make those puzzles. And the Kleenex of my memory that is totally destroyed and shattered and éparpillé. How do you say éparpillé? Scattered, you know, in dans de la merde blanche. This is really like the puzzle of Gaspard Winkler, and that Bartle Booth is not able to, you know, to construct anymore, because when the jigsaw puzzle is totally scattered, it's very difficult to see the whole image. And we are still trying, you know, to put all the pieces of the puzzle in order. I think, and anyway, like writing, it's like putting words into order. It's like, you know, it's to recollect and make lists and everything, so you can have, you know, you have, because it's so chaotic in your, and yeah, actually, so it has nothing to, there is no link, but in Latour, I was like, I didn't, you know, there is no real Möbius strip. It's not drawn in Latour. But did you know that the Möbius strip, it's also a conveyor, it's the form of the conveyor's belt. And actually, I talk a lot about conveyor's belt. And I didn't know why, and I think that I've read that they use the Möbius strip for conveyor's belt because it doubled the times of usage. And it's the same for the tapes, you know, the old audio tapes, it was also a Möbius strip, and it also doubled the time of the. And to me, it's beautiful because it means that this Möbius strip, it's a way to stretch time and to, yeah, maybe to put death and forgetfulness a little bit farther from us. So, yeah, so that's coming back to this metaphor with the Möbius strip and why we write and the creative process and how we put words like this jigsaw puzzle. I think it's, again, is to escape from time or something like this.
You mentioned shamanism earlier. Do you identify to some degree with that principle of the wounded healer? And because some of what you're doing is you're entering into the space of trauma, and you're not just healing yourself in the process. You know, everyone who's, you know, standing as witness to a degree is you know, involved in this.
I wanted to do a performance, but I don't know if I can do it now. I want to show you something. I don't know if I can see it now. I didn't prepare. Sorry. I don't know if it's here. Okay. Here. So, this sound is the sound of the voice of my grandmother, of Bang Wai. And actually, I was putting stuff in order in my mom's house, because it's very, you know, it's very full, and the garage is totally full, and there was like this big box, and there was old audio tapes, you know, those old audio tapes. Alan, he's so young, he doesn't know about audio tapes. And there was this audio tape, and there was nothing written in these audio tapes. And luckily enough, in my mom's house, because she doesn't throw away anything, there was this very old, you know, stuff to read audio tapes. and I put the audio tape in the machine, and I thought that I would, that it would be music, because at that time, because I'm much older than Alan, I would, go on to the radio and tape, like Blur or Oasis or whatever. And but then I was so surprised because I heard my grandmother's voice, and she was praying, and there was like 1 hour of my grandmother praying Topkin, because my grandmother, she was a shaman, she was spending hours and hours praying in front of the altar. And lately I had been scrolling into my family archives, video archives, and I have very, very few images from my grandmother. I just have maybe 1 or 2 minutes. And each time I see Bangwai, Bangwai is a grandmother, but on the maternal side. Each time I see Bangwai, she's like a statue, and she doesn't talk. And it's strange because she never spoke French. She always spoke Vietnamese, but she managed somehow to get the citizenship, and we never knew how she managed, because the legend says that she doesn't speak French, but it's not possible to get French citizenship if you don't speak French. So now we think that she has hidden the fact that she spoke French. And there's even a legend that someone has heard her talking French on the telephone, but no one, I don't have any proof, because she always said when we were speaking French, she said, "Không có hiểu, không có nói tiếng Pháp." I don't speak French. And so it was so moving for me to find her voice, speaking Vietnamese, praying. And it was very special for me because I would spend a lot of time with my grandmother when I was a kid. And I would have to stay with her when she was praying. And because she wanted me to speak Vietnamese, which was not the case because I had forgotten my Vietnamese when I went to school at 3 and I couldn't speak Vietnamese anymore. I really erased, French has really erased my mother tongue. But my grandmother, she would force me to read the Kin, so it's like not the Bible, like a Buddhist Bible, and I couldn't understand anything. But now I'm so grateful because thank of her, I can read the accents in the Vietnamese alphabet, and it really helped me when I learned Vietnamese. So it was so special, to find her voice. And especially in this moment when she was praying. So, when people say they don't believe in ghosts, when you find this kind of stuff, an old tape, and there is the voice of your grandmother at the very time when you are trying to get back to your mother tongue, so I think that's like a mathematical proof that ghosts exist.
And the Vietnamese believe in ghosts. Right, and I think I just came up. I just stumbled upon like a statistic actually to give more proof to spirituality. Among all East Asian cultures, Vietnamese are statistically practice more ancestral worship, ancestral veneration. Pew Research polls, I discovered this, compared to Taiwanese or Koreans or Japanese. And I think that speaks to the importance of spirituality for Vietnamese. When you were just talking about your grandmother, I started thinking about my own grandmother, right? Who has really late stage dementia. And I didn't grow up speaking Vietnamese, but I did start studying it later in adulthood, and now she has the impression of only ever speaking Vietnamese to me. So there's this kind of reparative thing through language that's happening between me and my grandmother in a way that I'm able to communicate with her in a way that I never was able to, and yet she seems to believe that this is how we've always communicated, which is like just a beautiful connection to me. I want to go back though to this notion of blank slate, of the Kleenex image, of Perec, where the washing machine, Perec has that famous quote, l'histoire avec sa grande H, right? History with its big H, but also its X, right? Where family history gets caught up in this washing machine. And how do we put these pieces back together with all these fragments of Kleenex that have been spread out in the lint catcher or whatever it's called, or across our clothes, and that's what you're trying to do in all of your work. But then the idea of blank slate and talking about your mother and this mentality that she has of wanting just like a new house, you write about that too in Le silence de mon père. There's this really poignant moment that my students really latched onto, actually, where you write that you had the impression that your family didn't have a history because you were surrounded actually by kitschy calendars from Ton Frère, which is like a Asian grocery store in Paris, by the cold cement of the house. Whereas your friends at school, they had history. They had these houses that they've inherited, that were linked to all the books that you were reading as well. And something about that really speaks to also the politics of France at the time that I think you're really in conversation with in Le silence de mon père, but also La Tour, where you're going back and forth between that moment of when you were growing up and creating these fictional narratives around that to current politics in France to 2045 and what could happen later in this Mobius strip conveyor belt formulation. So maybe if you could talk a little bit more about how you were thinking about that at the time of writing Le silence de mon père, but also its relevance today, its significance today.
Actually, I changed a lot because I remember when Le silence de mon père came out, a lot of people asked me about racism, anti-Asian racism, and I was like, no, I never had, I never experienced racism. And I would just tell stories, but like fun stories. Like, when one of my neighbors, she would harass me. First, she would go there because I was playing with the silent piano, and she would say, where is the sewing machine? Because she was convinced we had the sewing machine factory. And afterwards, we left the apartments, but she sued us on the syndicat de copropriété. And she said that we were, prostitutes, and because there was so many men, visiting us. So it was all the cliche, First the sewing machine factory, and then, the prostitutes. So like in, so many films and so many times. And so I would, tell story, but just, to like jokes. And people were like, what? And then I realized, oh yes, maybe that is racism. And maybe when people say chink, it's racist, But it's like I couldn't accept it because I was raised to believe that I would become 100% French. So because of universalism, to me there was no such things as racism, and I really wanted to erase this. Non-Frenchness and growing up in Le Mans, in this small town, when at that time there was I was always the only non-white in my classroom, so I remember reading all those books, and I remember being obsessed, especially by food, French food, and so I had two obsessions: French food in all the books I would be reading, like La Comtesse de Ségur or Zola, or each time, for example, in Zola, in Nana, it's one of my favorite novels from Zola, Émile Zola. there are all those descriptions of banquets and a lot of, very French recipes, vol au vent, and sometimes I didn't even know what it was. But to me, when I read those recipes, it was like wonderful. And I thought that if, for example, I always wanted to make milk rice. I don't know how, rice pudding. And I would try to put some milk in the rice cooker, so it was horrible. And then my mother would yell at me, because in one of the book of La Comtesse de Ségur, she does rice pudding, and I was like, oh my God, it must be so good, those rice pudding. And I would always try to do those rice pudding. So I would always, and I had a feeling that if I eat this French food, I would become blonde and like a regular French girl, And I had another obsession, which was Little Girl in the Prairie, that I read in French. And it's very funny because lately, afterwards, I just participated to the Cleaving, this review that will come out from Divan, the Diasporic Vietnamese Artistic Network. And I wrote a dialogue with Beth Nguyen. And Beth Nguyen, she wrote a novel about her obsession with Little Girl in the Prairie, because she grew up in Mississippi, also being very lonely because it was the only non-white family. And it was so weird when I found this novel, because I was like, okay, here is this Virtue growing up in the US, and she also has this weird passion for Little Girl on the Prairie, like me. And I was like, why we as Virtue, as Vietnamese diasporic people, why am I obsessed by Laura Ingalls? Why am I obsessed by this story about Pioneer? Why am I obsessed? And I was obsessed also by the recipe, and I would also always make the recipe that were written in the book. And I think, and La Comtesse de Ségur, it's also like children books that are very famous in France, and it's always stories about aristocrats. And I was fascinated by aristocrats. For example, I was fascinated by Marcel Proust, but I read Marcel Proust very first degree. I was, in love with La Duchesse de Guermantes, and I would, and I would also love le Duc de Saint-Simon, who was a very famous memorialist, and who would write during the King Louis XIV. And each time I would learn by heart the genealogical trees from all those aristocrats. So it's a little bit pathetic to be obsessed by aristocrats. But I think I was obsessed by aristocrats because I felt they had an history. Because you could trace the history, for centuries and centuries. And I remember the first time I used genealogy or ancestry, that kind of website. I put my name. But the problem is I didn't even know the first names of my grandfathers and grandmothers, because we don't really use first names. And anyway, we have like a lot of Vietnamese families. When we had our French citizenship, sometimes there are mistakes in our names. So anyway, our genealogy is cut. It's really the ash of Georges Perec, but it's really very real, because our names also sometimes were cut, were changed. So it's very difficult to dig into genealogy when your names were changed. We come back to Odysseus, who has so many identities. So yeah, I had this attraction to those history, and I felt that we as Vietnamese, we didn't have history, which was true, because when you look at film and when in the books I was reading, we were nowhere. So in some points, I guess it was true. I would just want to.
No.
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to read a little passage about Georges Perec, but I have to find it on my telephone. Or maybe from Latour, no. Okay. So it's just a little extract from Ellis Island. Oops. because actually I was disturbed during, I've seen that La Vie Mode d'Emploi Users and Life Manual, it was published in 78, and the action of the book, it takes place in 75. And in 75, all the Vietnamese diaspora knows it's really our, it's our year. It's the fall of Saigon. It's the reason why there are so many refugees. And somehow, when I see Life as a User's Manual, there is nothing about what is happening in Asia, and there is only one mention about Indochina, because I think Barthelbus is going to Indochina, but you don't have any more details. So I was frustrated, and I was like, what would Georges Perec tell about the refugee? And the only mention about the boat people, I found it in Ellis Island, and he says, at a time when boat people still keep going from one island to the next in search of ever more unlikely havens, it might seem ludicrous or pointless or sentimentally self-indulgent to want to recall these tales from an already distant past. But in doing so, we were sure of having resoundingly evoked the two words that lie at the very heart of this long venture, two intangible, precarious, weak, fugitive words that keep endlessly refracting each other's wavering lights and whose names are wandering and hope. So that's why I told you that I did not agree with the Harry Matthews translation, because in the French text, Georges Perec doesn't say wandering and hopes. He says terre natale and terre promise, which is the promised land and the native land, which is quite different. And the native land for us, there is a very beautiful word in Vietnamese, which is Nha. And Nha, it's home, it's family, it's my husband, my wife, my children, and it's the country and the homeland. So I love that Perec wrote about this notion of homeland, of Nha, and wandering and hope is very different to me. And I love also the fact that he makes this parallelism with present and past, because at the moment he's in Ellis Island, he's looking for his past. He's looking for his identity through the relics that are in Ellis Island. He's looking for the stories of the refugees. He's doing exactly the same as me when I went in Lampedusa, in Lesbos. He's interviewing all those refugees. And through those interviews, he's looking at the blank, at the void, which is the absence of the silence about his history, and he says also something which is so beautiful, that he's estranged from, in some way, I'm estranged from myself. In some way, I'm different. Not different from others, but from my own people. I don't speak the language my parents spoke. I share none of the memories they may have had, something that was theirs and made them what they were. And actually, this relates to all of us. And it shows that what he said as a child of Jewish people who were killed, finally is the same history for whatever immigrants we are, because we are always, when there is exile, it's very violent, because you are always estranged from yourself, and it's very violent not to speak the language of your parents. It's very violent to go back to your family and to sometimes need a translator, which was my case when I went back to Vietnam the very first time, and I was working on my memoir, Le silence de mon père, and I was trying to interview people in Vietnam in my family. The very first time, because I couldn't speak Vietnamese, I had to ask a translator. I had to ask one of my friends to be translator, and then my mother was very angry, because she said, "Why did you ask a stranger? He will listen to our intimate stories as a translator," and she didn't like that. But really, you don't have a choice. When you lost your mother tongue, if you want to gather this story, you have to do this. So I think this is this very unique violence of exile. And also, if I think about what my parents must have felt, especially my father, because my father has always spoken French with a very strong accent, and he was not comfortable in French. He read in Vietnamese, and I think his Nha, Sioran said that your land, your land, the real land you have, it's the language. And I think it's true. And my father, even if he had the French citizenship and even if he lived in France, French was never his home, Vietnamese was his home. So it must have been very violent for him to see that his own children couldn't share his language, the Vietnamese language.
We're going to make time for some questions, so you might want to prepare. I want to give you a chance to respond because there's quite a bit of material here.
Ooh, what to respond to among all that?
We can read an extract from Latour. I had prepared something, but I don't want to read it because I don't want to read it in English. Can you read it?
Could you tell us about the lovely box for a moment? Because, that's...
This is such a lovely box. It's the Max Sweeney, the next Max Sweeney. So it will be out, I think, at the end of the month. And so it's the result of a residency we did with Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. So it was really a life-changing experience for me because it was, thanks to Divan, I had the chance to spend time with other writers from the Vietnamese diaspora. So Vietnamese American, Vietnamese French, and even a Vietnamese from Israel, which was, I didn't even know there was a Vietnamese, a very small, but still a Vietnamese diaspora in Israel. And we had such bonds that were created during this time of the residency. And afterwards, T.B., who is a graphic novelist and who wrote the wonderful, the best we
could do.
No, I know the French title, so it's always the same problem with the titles. She talked to Dave Eggers, I think, because she knows him, and she told him about the residency and this experience, and afterwards they gave us the key to Max Sweeney, and so that's why this number 78 of Max Sweeney is totally Vietnamese, and really it's the first time I think this review is totally Viet Kieu. And I had this, I wrote a dialogue, and there is also an extract from my latest novel, Latour, which is translated. And I also tried to make a glossary of broken Vietnamese. And because I wanted also to talk about this broken language that is our heritage also, because we are not refugees, so I am not a refugee. My parents were, and I was born in France, and I grew up in France, and I became totally French. But still, I have all those, these boots of Vietnamese language in my mind, even if they are broken. And it's really part of my identity, and I really noticed it because now that I'm on the journey of getting back to my mother tongue and I'm learning back Vietnamese, I can see how deeply it has influenced the way I'm writing. For example, the fact that there are no tense, and the fact also the way I mixed je, tu, and all the personal pronouns is very influenced by the Vietnamese language. So, do you want to try to read the?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So it's a part of Latour where I talk about one of my characters. His name Victor Jung, Victor like Victor Hugo, because he was born during the French colonization. And here it is.
This is the imperfect subjunctive.
Yeah, exactly. Attends, je l'ai fait plus court, mais merde.
Sinon, je l'ai.
Non, mais je vais le faire plus court. Ok. C'est un peu long, mais bon. Sinon, je croyais que je l'avais coupé. Et... Bon, écoute, non, je l'avais. Bon, voilà, c'est
Il
celui-là.
faut que je commence. Ok.
Non, non, ça commence par Dien Bien Phu. Je l'ai coupé, mais j'espère que c'est pas trop.
Mais tu veux que je commence avec There Were No.
Non, non, au début, là. Attends.
Ok.
Non, ouais, parce qu'il y a aussi sur le présent.
Tout en haut.
C'est peut-être trop long, non? Ouais, ici, là. À partir de là.
French. Okay. French. It was the language of the colonizer, the language of the country that had enslaved his own, but also the language of elegance, the language of Victor Hugo, of Alphonse de Lamartine, who wrote Le Lac. Victor Chung loved everything about the French language. Their grandiloquent words, the lengthy sentences, the adverbs gleaming like dragon fruit, conspicuously pink on the outside and virginally white on the inside, the conjugations and declensions that transformed words. He loved to lose himself in the meanders of its complex grammar, hesitating over an agreement, a participle. He was Madame Bovary at the Marquis's ball, waltzing, entranced by the glow of the party lanterns and dazed by the smell of cigars and the melody of violins. Each language drew its own mental landscape. Vietnamese was like its skies, vaporous. Vietnamese was a language for ghosts, imprecise silhouettes forming in the humidity-saturated air in the twilight and misty dawns. It was a language of music, with 1,000 expressions for the sound of rain, the crackling drums of the monsoon, the discreet rippling of a morning sprinkle on a tin roof, the caressing hiss of drizzle when night falls on a red dirt road in the rice fields, and the heat rises from the ground and seems to condense into a heavy cloud of humidity. French was a Cartesian, rigorous language, sharp, a language of intellectuals, of learned theories, of precise metaphors. No one believed in ghosts in France, but in Vietnam, spirits dwelled with the living. Spirits were everywhere. In the twisting branches of the banyan tree, in the hearth fire, the photos of the dead, the bowl of rice and the offerings alongside the incense left at the very top of the ancestral altar. The living and the dead lived together. And perhaps that's why there was no need for time in Vietnamese. No past, no future, verbs frozen in an eternal present. The translation is beautiful. It really is beautiful.
It's Lelandil. The name of the translator is Lelandil.
Well, we can take some questions if you want to raise your hands. And if there's anyone online, we're happy to also take questions from there. Usually takes a moment for the little gray cells to agitate. Oh, good. Sorry.
Thank you so much. This has really been wonderful. Do correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed at certain points that you speak both of the importance to you of telling people's stories and of giving voice to others. And it seemed that in some moments those expressions were kind of indiscriminate for you, or that they were describing the same acts of writing or the same text or processes. So I was wondering if for you those feel like different responsibilities of yours or things that you do differently, or whether they sort of are par and the same.
It's very interesting because I think it's the same. For example, when I go to Ukraine and I interview people, or when I feel that they trust me with their stories, and their story also helped me to understand my own story. And it's so weird. For example, I'm talking about Ukraine, and to be honest, before the full-scale invasion, I didn't know anything about this country. I really thought it was like, some part of Russia. I'm ashamed, but it's really true. And it's the result of colonization. And afterwards, I really discovered, by all those interviews, meeting Ukrainian people, wonderful Ukrainian people, and they explained me how Ukrainian had been erased by Russian language. And actually in France, we love Russia, and we love Russian language, and I love Russian literature. So I was really the best person to be influenced by, this erasure. And the only Ukrainian writer that I knew. It was Andrei Kurkov, and Andrei Kurkov, why? And he's famous in France because he writes in Russian. And I couldn't quote even one writer or poet that writes in Ukrainian. And so afterwards, it's so interesting because I met by chance a couple, Pavlo Matyusha, he's a writer, and he was on the front line. And I met his wife, Viktoria, who was refugee in France. And I asked them to write like a journal de bord, a journal, some letters, a diary, like a diary with 2 voices for my newspaper. And afterwards, they wrote beautiful letters, and I knew it was a book, so I helped them to find a publisher, and it became a book. But they asked me because we were having those conversation, endless conversation about the comparison between colonization in Vietnam, Vietnamese language, exile. And of course, I know that all those questions were because they have 4 children. And now that Viktoria is a refugee, she was wondering what, would be the future as a refugee. So it was weird because she kind of related, with my experience. And of course, we made the thread you were talking about, weaving the thread. And there was this thread which was so evident between the Vietnam War and this war in Ukraine. And so they asked me to add this 3rd voice to this book, which was really not, expected. Never in my life did I imagine that I would write a book about Ukraine, this country that I didn't know, And it's funny because during this residency, that's when I wrote this 3rd voice. So, and I must say, I'm sure it's the only book about the Ukraine war with Vietnamese language and with Vietnamese accents. I'm sure it's the only one because I wanted to build this bridge, between Vietnam and Ukraine. And again, I will talk about Lebanon because of Sabine. Just before arriving in Villa Albertine, there's another writer who asked me a text. He's Lebanese, and actually, when we met, we didn't know each other, but it was like he was my cousin, And he told me when Beirut was bombed, in Auten, the most horrible thing for him was to see his father in front of the television. And it was like, again, the Mobius strip, it was coming back like in 75 and the Civil War, and always the same images of being away from his home and seeing your country being bombed, And I remember that my father, he was also looking on the television, and my mother, she sent me this WhatsApp message, which is so funny. She said, your father is very disturbed by the bombing in Beirut, and he keeps on talking about that. And he's aphasic, as I said. And I was like, oh, wow. So with the bombing, he can talk right now. He's so disturbed that he can talk. So I sent it to one other Lebanese friend to make a bad joke about that. So it was a bad joke, but still, he was very depressed. So I was trying to send some jokes. And I realized that 1975, which is such a, to me, it's like, because it's the fall of Saigon, it's the année zéro, it's really such a symbolic. And I realized that for Lebanese it was the same. 75, it was, the beginning of the Civil War. And it was another invisible thread, during all the... And also the other, it's also a civil war, so it's also a very complicated war. And I remember meeting Colum McCann when he wrote this book about American Mother and after Aperogon. And we were talking about the fact that he's from Ireland and I'm from Vietnam, so he has some part of his family, North Ireland, Southern Ireland, and my father is from the north, my mother is from the south. So there's a big part of my family who still is in the north and who followed the communists. So they would be seen as enemies for all the Vietnamese diaspora. And for a very long time, we didn't connect with them because they were supposed to be the enemies. And it's our generation who, has pulled the thread, connected, because finally maybe this history was far away, so it was possible to have this relationship again. And he said that maybe because we are, from very contradictory history, so we are used to see all those sides. We are used to write as others and to also understand the side of the enemy, because finally even in our families we have different parts, and even people who are enemies. So we have to struggle with our own enemies, and maybe it learns it teaches us empathy, empathy even towards our enemy. And I think we need to have this empathy even towards our enemy, because if we just anyway, I hate, I don't want to be a victim. So, and I think that's the reason why when journalists would ask me if I had experienced racism, I would say never in my life, because it's not an identity being a victim of history. It's really a bad position. And it's much better to understand your enemy, to feel for him, and I think that's why I'm always attracted with two-sided stories, and those all complex story when you have two sides, even if sometimes it's really, really tricky, but still, and because Vietnam is the product of a two-sided story, yeah, it was very hard for me to understand this story, and still now I'm not sure I can totally grasp it. But it doesn't matter, even I'm not trying to make a point. I'm not trying to demonstrate anything. I just want to, build this bridge and connect with those people, even if they were not on my side. And yeah, and that's why, to come back to your question, that's the link between giving a voice to the people I meet, and giving a voice to my people, because it's the same. Finally, the people that I interview, they really helped me to find a voice for my people.
Do you want to respond to any of this, or?
Yes, please. Actually. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Because I was just thinking, as you brought up colonialism, thinking through the passage that I just read about Victor's relationship to French. You not knowing, or people not knowing about Ukraine, and people not knowing about Ukraine, you said, was an issue of colonialism, right? And that's how colonial aphasia functions, right? Like it deprives us of the language, of the tools to be able to unpack this history, to be able to talk about this history, and to be able to see the connections between Vietnam, Ukraine, with Palestine, with Israel, with Lebanon, where all of these issues are results of the ongoing consequences and continuations of colonization. And even in the sense of not being able to communicate or speak your mother tongue is because of colonization, or not knowing much about the history of Vietnam is because of colonization, where I think I brought this up to you in May or June last year, where it felt like France's erasure of the French Indochina War was was partly due to the way that the Vietnam War sort of eclipsed that. This kind of what's the word? Like
I think that Hollywood
absolutely
has erased the Indochina War.
Absolutely.
And actually there is the, and it's real because in Apocalypse Now, which is, the most famous film about the Vietnam War, there is a sequence that was erased. I don't know if you have seen the final cut of Apocalypse Now, which is I prefer the final cut. In the final cut, there is one sequence when the boat stops in a French plantation, a French domain, and there is Aurore Clément, who is a French actress, and it's a very weird sequence, very honorific, and you see those French guys, and they are there, they are colonialists, and they say, we will stay there forever because it's our land, and they have dinner with the guys, the American GI, and finally this sequence that talks about Indochina War, it was erased in the Apocalypse Now that we know. And to me, that was such a perfect metaphor because obviously, because there were so many films about the Vietnam War, no one really remembers the Indochina War, and the only thing we were talking yesterday about Indochine, the film Indochine, and in France, the only image we have about this war is the film Indochine, where Catherine Deneuve is this very rich and beautiful landowner. So she's the colonialist, but she's so beautiful and so glamorous that you after this film you're like, oh my God, colonization, that was so great, you know, because Catherine Deneuve is so beautiful, and you're like, oh, and why? Because she has an adoptive daughter, and the adoptive daughter, she goes with the Viet Minh, and she fights for independence. And I remember very clearly that the very first time I saw Indochine, I was a teenager, and I didn't identify with Catherine Deneuve's daughter, and I didn't understand why she wanted to fight for independence. And I was like, what? Your mother, adoptive mother, she was so nice with you. Why don't you stay with your adoptive mother? Which is very, very disturbing now, because I'm like, you know, I understand that when I saw this film, I was really so convinced that finally, yeah, colonization was something good, and we rebelled, you know, against our adoptive parents. And it's funny because in colonization, you always have this vocabulary of parents and children, and the colonized countries, they are the children, and you know, it's like they are not totally human. Their children are little animals, and they have to be cared, you know. So that's why France or UK or the America will. And actually, when you read Autant n'emporte le vent, Gone with the Wind, the same, you know. I think when I read Gone with the Wind, I would believe, you know, this narrative of nice slave owners, you know, and it's really the narrative of Gone with the Wind, because, and they always say that slaves are like, you know, children, and they can't take care of themselves, you know, and you have exactly the same thing. And when you read those old texts during colonization, they always say things like this. They always say that the Vietnamese people are very nice, but they are like children, and so we have to take care about this country. And finally, the metaphor with Indochine is really this, because Catherine Deneuve, she adopts this Vietnamese princess, Linh Dan Pham, and then the adoptive children rebels, and I remember that when I found the citizenship, the papers in the archives of my parents, it was written that they were not naturalized, they were reintegrated. So because they were born indigenous in the during the French colonial time, and so when they asked for French citizenship, they were reintegrated. A little bit like, you know, the spoiled child has rebelled against the nice colonizer, but now, okay, we forgive you, we will give you back. So there is this complex relationship with France, of course, which was our, you know, the place that has colonized. And on the other hand, as my character Victor, I love French, you know, my nya is really this French language. So it's weird because it's It's the language that has erased my mother tongue. It's the language that also has erased a part of Vietnamese, because during colonization, before colonization, Vietnamese was written with Chinese ideograms, the nom. And after colonization, it was changed. During colonization, it was changed through a Latin alphabet, which was okay because it also helped people to read, because it was easier to learn to read with this alphabet. But on the other hand, it's very strange because it cuts. We come back to la hache de Georges Perec, the axe, because it cuts the etymology of the words. And because you don't know the etymology, the Chinese etymology, and because all those old texts and all the, for example, all the inscription in the temples, they are written in nom, in the Chinese language, so the Sino-Vietnamese language. It means that the Vietnamese, when they go to their own temples and their own graveyards, sometimes they cannot read what is written on it. And that's a real effect of colonization, you know, something which is very concrete.
We have time for maybe one more question. Yes.
Thank you so much, Doan and Alan. It was extremely inspiring. And I think that everyone in the room, and I'm sure online as well, is related somehow, I mean, to what you have shared tonight. So thank you to you both. I actually have a question for Peter Maravelis, because the relationship between the Oulipo, Perec, Doan's work is quite clear to me. I'm wondering why the Oulipo is so fundamental for you, I mean, Peter, and I'd love to hear more about that.
It's an opportunity. And I think that who doesn't enjoy play? And I think that play is an excellent way to introduce people to a subject matter. When Perec and Matthews began to translate each other's work, and when they formed this friendship, little did they know that it would also create a bridge between France and the US. There were publishers in the US. James Laughlin at New Directions, you had Barney Rossett at Grove Press, and then later, you know, there was Dalkey Archive, which of course, you know, takes to this day Oulipo very seriously, in the spirit of play. So I think that this is also why 826 Valencia, some of the instructors who work with children use some of these constraints to teach reading and writing. Yeah. So this finds us at the end of the evening. I want to thank you all for joining us, and Alan and Doan and of course,
so much, Alan. I'm so lucky to have Alan with me today. And to meet him back on Tuesday, I'm so lucky. Thank you for your words and your talents.
And of course, Villa Albertine and Sabine, thank you so very much, and the whole team.
Sabine, of course.
Which,
and Ivan.
Yeah, and yes. So, and so those of you online, thank you also for joining us. We have posted some links if you want to learn more about Doan's work. Please do check it out, and also Villa Albertine. So, thanks for joining us.